Waterloo. It's one of the most famous battles in all of history, right? And it's usually told as a pretty simple story. One big winner, one big loser. But what if that's not the whole picture? Today, we're going to look at how the question of who really won and why Napoleon lost is actually way more complex and honestly, a lot more fascinating than you might think. So let's start with the man himself, Napoleon Bonaparte. A year after his defeat, thinking it all over from his exile on St. Helena, this was his take. Incomprehensible day. I mean, that's a pretty stunning admission from a military genius who, up until then, seemed to get the art of war better than literally anyone in Europe. So what really happened on that incomprehensible day? Was it the pure genius of his opponent, the Duke of Wellington? Was it the failure of his own generals? Or was there another force entirely that was the real deciding factor? That's what we're going to unpack by looking at the battle from a few different angles. To understand how it all went so wrong for Napoleon, you've got to appreciate the incredible gamble he was taking. This wasn't just another battle for him. This was a desperate, all-or-nothing shot at getting his empire back. The stakes, they just couldn't have been any higher. So he's escaped from exile on the island of Elba, and Napoleon knows the clock is ticking. He's got this tiny window to get his empire back on its feet before all of Europe can team up and just completely crush him. His plan was incredibly bold, and it all came down to one thing: speed. And just look at how fast this all happens. In a little over 3 months, he goes from being in exile to being the Emperor of France all over again, with the rest of Europe basically declaring him an outlaw. By June 15th, he's already on the attack, pushing into Belgium to hit the Allied armies before they can link up.
Now, here's what's so interesting about these numbers. Yeah, Napoleon is outnumbered overall, but his strategy is kind of brilliant. He wants to wedge his army right between Wellington's Anglo-Allied force and Blücher's Prussians. The goal? Beat them one at a time so they can never join forces. His entire campaign, everything, hinges on keeping them separated.
And you know what? He almost pulls it off. The battle itself was unbelievably close. In fact, Wellington himself called it the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life. For hours on that day, the fate of all of Europe was just hanging by a thread. So it all comes to a head right here, late in the afternoon. French troops managed to capture this key farmhouse, La Haye-Sainte. This punches a massive hole right in the middle of Wellington's line. Suddenly, French cannons can fire at point-blank range. Victory for Napoleon doesn't just seem possible, it looks like it's about to happen. But just as Napoleon is about to break through, the one thing he gambled his entire empire on not happening, well, it happens. The Prussians arrive. And this, right here, is where the story of Waterloo splits into two very different tales. Let me introduce you to Field Marshal Gebhard von Blücher. Just 2 days earlier, Napoleon had hammered his army at another battle. Now, by any normal military thinking, Blücher should have retreated. But this guy, a tough old soldier who had a deep personal hatred for Napoleon, did something totally unexpected. He promised Wellington he'd march to help him. That one decision changed everything. And this slide really lays out the whole historical debate. For a long time, especially in Britain, the story went that the Prussians kind of showed up late to the party after Wellington had already done most of the heavy lifting. But the other view, the revisionist one, says no way. It argues they were absolutely essential. Their arrival wasn't just a lucky break, it was part of Wellington's plan, and their attack on Napoleon's flank forced him to pull his best troops, the Imperial Guard, away from the main event. Just look at this image. It really shows you how intense that other fight was. This wasn't some minor distraction. This was a brutal, full-on battle for the village of Plancenoit, raging on Napoleon's right side. The Prussians fought here for hours, and it forced Napoleon to send in units of his elite guard just to stop a total collapse. Every single soldier he sent there was one he couldn't use for that final, decisive punch against Wellington. So, with the Prussians chewing up his flank and his main attack grinding to a halt, Napoleon makes one last desperate roll of the dice. And it fails spectacularly. Later, stuck in exile on that lonely island, he had plenty of time to think. And to build the story of why none of it was his fault. Can you just imagine the shock? The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's legendary, never-defeated super soldiers, are sent in to finally break Wellington's line. But they're met with this wall of fire, and they fall back. For the first time in 15 years, a cry spreads across the battlefield. La garde recule. The guard is retreating. And with those words, the French army's will to fight just shatters. So how did Napoleon explain this total disaster? Well, in his version of events, the blame gets passed around a lot. First up, Marshal Grouchy. This was the guy he'd sent with a huge chunk of his army to chase the Prussians. According to Napoleon, it was Grouchy's incompetence, his failure to stop Blücher, that cost him the battle.
Okay, next on the blame list, his other commanders. He claimed his top marshal, Ney, appeared bewildered, that another general was useless. In Napoleon's telling, his once brilliant generals had just become a bunch of guys who had lost their nerve.
And what about Wellington, the guy who actually beat him? Napoleon just dismissed him as a bad general who took too many risks. But here's the funny part. In trying to downplay Wellington's role, he actually ends up giving more credit to the Prussian commander, Blücher, for pulling his beaten army together and showing up.
And, when blaming his generals and belittling his enemies just wasn't enough, there was always one last excuse. In the end, Napoleon concluded that the loss really came down to something completely out of his hands. It was simply fate. Okay, so after hearing Napoleon's side of the story, where does that leave us? Who did really win Waterloo? Should the credit go to the British, the Prussians, or was it actually all about the mistakes made by the French?
Well, modern historians like David Chandler here have a much more balanced view. The general thinking now is that the Prussian contribution was absolutely vital. It wasn't just that they showed up, it was the constant threat of them showing up all afternoon that totally shaped Napoleon's decisions and drained his best troops.
So in the end, there really isn't one simple answer, is there? You can make a great case for Wellington's incredibly stubborn defense. You can make an equally strong case for Blücher's game-changing arrival. And of course, for Napoleon's own uncharacteristic blunders. Maybe the truest answer is that it wasn't any single army's victory, but a real coalition effort. And that kind of brings us to a final, really important idea. A battle might be decided in a single day, but the story of that battle, who won, who lost, and why, that's something that gets fought over for centuries. Waterloo marked the end of Napoleon's empire, but the battle over how we remember it, that's still going on. Thanks for digging into this with us.